getting up at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning to catch the train from Cardiff to London. But speaking up for libraries is one of those good reasons, because somebody has to. Because the minister with responsibility for doing that doesn't seem to be up to the job. He seems to have become virtually invisible. I was so concerned about his lack of presence on this issue. I looked up the list of ministerial responsibilities just in case he'd been reshuffled without me knowing. It seems he's still in the job, but I still can't quite work it out. And then I came across a photo on the internet which seems to explain why it is we haven't seen very much of him lately. And anyway, his political epitaph will be not minded to intervene. Not minded to intervene is what he will be remembered for, I think. And not minded to intervene at a time when local government is facing a financial black hole of 2 billion a year extra by the year. It's widening by 2 billion a year, with likely to reach 14 billion by 2020. That's local government as a whole. In the library service, as you know better than I do, over the last few years, thousands of jobs have disappeared with all the expertise that goes with those. Hundreds of libraries have either closed or been taken out of public control. Staffing levels are down in many of those libraries that remain, and staff are being given, reassigned, or have been obliged to take on new duties which are more akin to extra council duties, as council functions have been put inside libraries in the so-called hubs and so on. There have been cuts in opening hours, cuts in funding, with the obvious depletion in book stock, and many of the libraries that remain are in a form of slow-motion closure, actually. They may say this library is not closed, but actually they're closing by the member of staff, by the book, by the pound that's cut, by the hour that's cut from the opening hours. Those are closures by stealth, really. They've been allowed to wither on the vine. Now, if that's not a crisis, then I don't know what is a crisis. But let's take a step back from that for a moment, because the foundation of the library network is the local branch library, and this is my local branch library. I was taken to this library by my father. His father took him. My kids have gone to this library. It's actually quite a small local branch, but when you're 6 or 7 and you go in there, you think it's an enormous place. It seems to have millions of books, and I can remember thinking, I wonder how long it's going to take me to read all the books in this library, because once I've done that, I'll know everything. Well, obviously that didn't quite work out, but little did I know then that I wasn't far off the mark in terms of some of the ideas about libraries, because the legendary Library of Alexandria had its goal of collecting together the total knowledge of the entire human race. Now, they didn't succeed in doing that, so my little branch library 1600 years later didn't have much of a chance of doing that either. But in one sense I was right, because whether it's a small library like this one, or one of the fantastic, enormous sort of super libraries like the Library of Congress, or the Hofbibliothek Vienna, or the new Library of Birmingham, it does have something in common with all of them. Whether they're large or small, libraries share one feature, and that's, Neil Gaiman put it fantastically well recently. He said they're gates to the future. And they're also doors to different worlds in space and time, as Doctor Who may say later on this evening. But the current programme of cuts and closures threatens to padlock those doors, to chain up those gates for good. And I want to look for a moment for the justification of that programme of cuts and closures. How can they justify this? How does ministers and councils justify this? Well, it's usually one or both of two arguments. The first is, we don't need libraries anymore. And the second is, we can't afford them even if we did need them. So let's look at those arguments for a second. First of all, this idea that the internet means the end of libraries. You've all heard the argument, libraries are outdated, get real, it's the internet world, kids are only interested in digital and so on, you know. So you don't need libraries because you can get everything on the internet. Well, let's look at that for a moment. After all, we've had libraries in one form or another, more or less since we've had writing. When the Sumerians invented writing 3,500 years ago, 3,500 years BC rather, they started to catalogue what they'd written down. obviously they need to do. As soon as you write something down, you need to catalogue it. And they called their, they were probably the first librarians, if you think about it, the Sumerians. They called their cataloguers the ordainers of the universe. If Silip ever reopened the name change debate, then this is where I put my money. Anyway, we're told that technology makes libraries redundant. Everyone can get whatever they want on the internet these days, except, of course, that they can't. Now, Terry Deary may think that we're all living in some internet-driven global village, but he's in very serious danger of becoming the global village idiot by not paying attention to the reality of the situation. And the reality is there is an enormous digital divide in Britain today. There are 7 million people who've never used the internet. This is not 7 million people who have rubbish connections or who occasionally use the internet, who don't have broadband. This is 7 million adults who have never, ever used the internet. Now, it's a fair argument to say that's probably going to come down. That number will come down. But in fact, the internet makes libraries more relevant, not less. And I'm a big fan of books. I like the feel, I like the smell, I like the touch of books. But I use digital as well. And even, I don't think we're going to see the end of books personally. But even if that was true, even if we are going to see the end of books, that's irrelevant actually. Because the point is really not whether or not this or that platform for information changes. It's the point is access to information. Access to culture, access to the written word, however that is stored and processed. And today we face an information glut that nobody in history has ever faced, the like of which nobody in history has ever faced. 1 week's worth of the New York Times contains more information than a person would come across in their entire lifetime in the 18th century. This year we will produce, on the planet, on the world scale, we will produce more information than the totality of the previous 5,000 years. That's the kind of information glut we're facing. As they used to say in Hill Street, it's a jungle out there. And we need a guide for that. And the librarians and the libraries are our guide through that jungle, that information jungle. But that's not all. It's also not true that we have unlimited access to all parts of the internet. Not only is it not true that everybody has access to the internet, even those of us who do have access to the internet don't have unlimited access to all of the internet. You only have to think of paywalls and subscription journals to know that that is simply not true. And libraries are already tackling this issue. There was a great article this week which talked about how there's a pilot project running which will allow public library users to have free access to subscription academic journals and to give better access than actually most universities have got, and they pay for them. So there are changes taking place in the digital world which are matching up to the changes taking place. The libraries are matching up to those changes, rather. And from an unusual source, we saw a good argument for this as well. The Conservative Party recently removed all of its speeches before the last election. All those embarrassing speeches that Cameron and Osborne made, promising they wouldn't reorganise the NHS or get rid of Short Start or axe EMA, those have all gone. And they didn't just take them off their site, they removed them from the internet. Now, luckily, the British Library does something called data capture. So I think Cameron should thank the British Library for making sure his speeches are still available, and we'll be able to see what he actually said about the NHS before he was elected and compare it to what he's actually doing about it today. So there is that as well that libraries do. They preserve information. They're a resource. Even with the internet, there's still a resource. In fact, especially with the internet in a way. Finally, research, and all you librarians will love this one, research carried out by the University of Berkeley in California compared the effectiveness of using search engines with the effectiveness of going and asking a librarian. You won't be surprised to know search engines lost. So they were doing an experiment to test this idea that you don't need the internet, to persuade their students to actually use their libraries, not rely on Google. And if you've read some of the essays I've written, Mark, you'll realise why the internet has got its problems. Another argument is everybody buys books. They're cheap, they're easily available. Everyone who wants to read can buy a book. Well,
it's not really the full picture, is it? Because everyone who's got kids knows at the rate at which those kids plough through books, and almost anyone couldn't really keep up with the purchasing you'd need to do to keep your kids happy with books. So that's one clear and obvious reason why it's not true. Secondly, a lot of people simply can't afford books. However cheap they are, people are... I saw a figure the other day, you may know this type of figures, but living in Wales, it's not one of the richest parts of the UK. We're standing in one of the richest parts of the UK, but Wales isn't one of them. To the extent that if you earn more than 30,000 a year in Wales, you're in the top decile of earners in Wales. Now, if you're earning 30,000 in London, probably people think, yes, so why didn't you get a good job? But in Wales, that is the good job. And if you're earning sort of 15,000, 10,000, whatever, buying books every week is not a realistic option. Finally, buying books doesn't preclude borrowing books anyway. So the idea that they're in conflict is not true. So none of these arguments about the internet or cheap books even touch on the myriad of other arguments about what libraries do and why they're valuable. So those things I think we can put to one side. This is what I like to think of as David Cameron's Marie Antoinette moment, or the bling and eye. And it's relevant to the point about whether we can afford libraries in this time of austerity. And this operates at several levels. At local authority level, you sometimes hear the argument that if libraries stay open, then other services have to close. But there are a lot of questions we need to ask about that. Firstly, how do some authorities find the money for new central super libraries, but apparently are unable to support a library network, a branch network? How is that possible? Why do councils continue to spend millions on private sector consultancies? Why has the public sector as a whole, not just councils in this, spent £4 billion in the last year? That's not a mistake, £4 billion on outsourcing with just 4 companies in the last year. That's just 4 companies. And why do we continue with budgetary systems which operate in silos? Closing libraries incurs costs elsewhere in terms of the local community cohesion, literacy, and so on. There are economic costs that you can work out. Even neoliberal economists can work these out, but they choose not to. They operate in silo budgets. And there needs to be a way of capturing and reflecting the realities of the positive social and economic impact of libraries. But the cuts are real. That's no question about that. And ultimately, however efficient, in terms of the government's definition of efficient, however efficient a local council is, there are limits to what it can do. So we have to look at the UK level. And this is where Cameron's speech becomes relevant. Because ever since the financial crash of 2008, we've been told by politicians of all parties, not just the Conservative Party, but all parties, and it's become the approved and accepted consensus that the deficit has created an extraordinary situation. And this requires massive cuts to put right. We're all in this together, as you can see from the slide. But actually, in his speech to the Lord Mayor's banquet, Cameron fundamentally changed the debate. He said we need austerity permanently. In other words, it's not a temporary adjustment because of economic necessity. It's actually a political goal to reduce the size of the public sector permanently. Now, after spending a lot of time attempting to depoliticise discussion of the crisis, his Mansion House speech effectively conceded that the debate is not economic, it's political. And that means it all changes. The game changes. Why does this matter? Because it confirms that however serious the crisis, and it is a serious crisis, there's no question about that. Let's not forget who brought it about, the financial sector. There's always, however serious the crisis, there is always more than one response. There's always more than one potential approach. There's always more than one answer. And is the government really saying that we cannot afford to run a public library service in the 21st century, despite the World Bank categorising the UK as the 6th richest country in the world? That is idiotic, frankly. So what is the answer from the government? They seem to be giving us 3 options, basically. The first option seems to be a general rundown of the system. They seem to be saying, just run the whole thing down. Staff cuts, reduce overall numbers, reduce the number of professionals, de-skilling process takes place. Budget cuts, we cut the quality and range of books, materials available, move the libraries into shared premises, whether council services and so on, and then cuts in opening hours, which reduce access for the public, all kind of cut back in a kind of general overall approach. And some councils and ministers seem to think that a couple of bookshelves in a box room at the back of a sports centre, or some form of self-service machine with a few hundred books to choose from at a local Tesco, is an adequate replacement for a branch library. But as Michael Rosen said, a library without a librarian is just a room with books. And I think library staff and library users have been through difficult times before, as this picture of a London library in 1940 illustrates. I think they must have had this, that slogan in mind, you know, keep calm and carry on. But even at that worst point of the Great Depression, or the 2 world wars, there was a sense of the possibility of a better tomorrow in terms of the library service. The growth and development of the library service may have slowed or even stalled in those periods of national catastrophe, but it never went backwards. And that's exactly what's happening today. This is the first time, really, that it's going backwards on the sort of scale that has taken place. Now, the second option the government is encouraging is for volunteers to take over the running of local branches under threat. In my opinion, this is the most dishonest policy of the lot, because it wraps itself up in feel-good phrases about choice, civic involvement, the big society and so on, while cynically dumping the responsibility for the running of the library in the lap of volunteers who are desperate to keep open a valued civic amenity. I have a lot of respect for the volunteers who take on this task. Often they're the most enthusiastic supporters of the library in the locality, and many of them are well aware of the Hobson's choice with which they're presented. Vasey says that volunteer-run libraries are a way of growing the library service, not replacing it, and an additional element of provision. Now, maybe his definition of additional is different to mine, but he says it's an additional. I mean, this is a breathtaking piece of cynical politician speak, I think. In reality, the attraction for ministers at some councils is precisely that it is a replacement. And it's a replacement that is usually cheaper, although there are hidden costs in it, by the way, anyway, as you probably know more than I do. And it has all the obvious potential problems of fragmentation, sustainability, skill sets, and staffing levels, and so on, that you would expect from such a development. Can volunteers play a positive role? Yes, of course they can. I think they can play a very positive, supportive role. They are, by definition, some of the most committed library supporters and library users. But as many of them themselves have pointed out, this policy is rarely an example of an expansion of the capacity of civil society, still less an imaginary involvement of the community in improving services. Usually, it's a last-ditch attempt to keep open a service under threat, and most of those involved would no doubt prefer to retain a council-funded, professionally and well-trained, with a professional and well-trained workforce. The third option is that of privatisation. We've seen an example of where that leads this week. As though working from the script of a Christmas panto villain, Carillion have barely had time to change the nameplates on the door since they've taken over the library contracts they got hold of, before they started issuing redundancy notices to staff. Not only was there no discussion with the service users about whether they wanted a different service provider, as Lang got rid of it, sold it to Carillion, but there's been not a single word of consultation about what impact these redundancies are likely to have on the level or quality of service. The only imperative for Carillion is the bottom line. I mean, their timing is impeccable, with the criticism of outsourcing of public services by the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee this week, following closely on from the National Audit Office's report with this damning list of problems in relation to private provision of public services, which included the lack of real competition, the overlong, inflexible contracts, the hidden costs, and the inadequate scrutiny of those contracts. And they might have added the complete lack of transparency, because they're not covered by the Freedom of Information Act, and the patchy performance of a lot of these characters when they provide public services. The Financial Times put it very well, I thought, last week, or the week before, accusing private contractors of hitting the targets but missing the point. And that's not surprising, really. When you see a library user, they see a revenue stream. Where you see a library, they see a profit centre. Where you see free and open access to the culture of the written word, they see product and market share. It's a different way of looking at the world. So where does that all leave us? It's not an accident that every tyrant, tin pot dictator, and autocratic government have liked burning books and censoring written work. It's neither is an accident that every social group struggling for its freedom has highlighted literacy as a key tool of that freedom. And that's as true of the industrial working class in Britain as it was of the slaves in the southern United States. In both cases, where the masters couldn't prevent the spread of literacy, they tried to control what was read. And Voltaire's pamphlet, where he talks about the horrible danger of reading, is a brilliant satire on that approach. Why do they concentrate on that? Because reading leads to reflection, and reflection leads to action. These are dangerous things for tyrants. So it really shouldn't be any surprise that libraries, public libraries in particular, have always been associated with democracy, liberty, equality, and justice. It's not an accident. They're a key part of that struggle. They're a unique public space. They're an example of what William Morris called neighbourly common sense. They stand against the commodification of knowledge and for universal and equal access on the basis of right rather than wealth. They stand against censorship and for the public's right to know. Most of all, they stand for the citizen, not the consumer. So, can libraries do better? Of course they can. Can libraries allocate resources more effectively? Almost certainly. Can libraries do more to involve local communities? Without a doubt. But none of this points to the wrecking ball of the current programme of cuts and closures. Every period in our history has its own particular lexicon of words which are associated with it. In the future, no doubt, people will look back on the early years of the 21st century in Britain and be absolutely astonished to see that the contribution to English vocabulary of one of the world's richest countries was payday loans, the bedroom tax, and food banks. Only it could be worse. Our children and grandchildren won't forgive us if we allow library closures to become a part of that dictionary of shame. And in conclusion, when we look at what we can do, which is the purpose of today's conference after all, well, what we can do is, by your presence here, you've already begun to change things, I think. The Welsh social theorist Raymond Williams spoke of the need to draw on resources of hope. And this conference is one of those resources of hope, I think. The centre of gravity of the political debate moves, it changes. One email, one protest, one conference at a time. But change it can, and change it will, and you are part of what will make it change. All over the country, library users and supporters are working with the workers of the library service, Unison branches of the Women's Institute, community groups, residents' organisations. We need to encourage all of that. We need to encourage those groups to work together. We need to encourage the groups to work on a wider geographical basis, to network those groups up so they talk to each other and bring them into contact with all of those other groups attempted to change the political weather, to change what is seen as the political common sense. In a very rich country like ours, what we spend money on is dominated by politics rather than economics. Whether we choose to spend billions on Trident or subsidising French and Chinese nuclear companies, or the HS2 rail link, or foreign military intervention, or on services like public libraries, are essentially political decisions. In these circumstances, all politicians are vulnerable. All policies can be changed. Politicians make political decisions about costs, and we need to ensure that they're well aware that there will be political costs to their political decisions. We should hold them to account for what they do and make them change the policies that they put forward. And you, by defending, extending and expanding the notion of not just libraries, but public libraries in the context of public services, have already begun to change the terms of the debate. And that's the first step to changing the reality. And thanks very much for listening.